Welcome to Minding Men. I'm your host, Brian Pollack. Today's show is going to be about gender. How do males identify themselves within their gender? Or could the gender be different than what we expect in the perspective of each man that experiences their own gender? Today, we have as our guests Dr. Heidi Dalzell and Kayti Protos, both of Bucks Support Services. Dr. Dalzell is the clinical director and has been in practice for 20 years, focusing on eating disorders, recovery, gender, and mental health. And Kayti Protos has been the clinical coordinator of Bucks Support Services, where she's also an adjunct faculty member at Holy Family University, as well as focusing and specializing in addiction, recovery, gender, and eating disorders. Thank you both so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us, Brian.
Absolutely. We've spoken before the show, and one of the things that really came up for me as I was getting to know the two of you and your unique, pretty great perspectives is really how can we identify gender? How do we understand it?
I love that question, Brian. And I loved your introduction as well, because I think it's such a good lead in into that idea of gender identity. When we think about gender, sometimes our definition's pretty narrow. We think about, a child being born, child's born with, certain biological parts, genitalia. And as soon as the doctor sees the child, they'll say, okay, this is a boy or this is a girl. What we really find is that kids and adults too actually have more of an inner sense of gender. And sometimes that inner sense of gender doesn't correspond with the body that they're born into. So what I'm talking about is the idea of gender identity, which is a person's inner understanding of their gender, such as male or such as female or such as some other gender.
Hmm. And would you say that when someone gets labeled from birth throughout their lives and they go through many different experiences, whether it's on the playground or it's in their own family or it's, I don't know, it could be in a sport. Would you say that sometimes the individual who might possibly not fully identify with let's call it the binary, the absolute of a gender, could that cause for them a confusion, a misunderstanding? How does someone like that, what do they go through? Can you give us examples of what they've been through or what you've seen?
Sure. I mean, I think both Heidi and I have seen in our practice a number of folks who fit that exact experience. Folks who, as they're navigating, whether they're younger children or maybe teenagers, and even as adults, they're navigating an experience and start to come aware that they don't feel like their body fits how they're experiencing their world. To Heidi's point, that their gendered body, this label that was given to them at birth, doesn't match the gender that they feel like they are inside. So to kind of make a concrete example out of that, imagining a teenage child talking to his parents saying, I think I'm a boy. And just to kind of simplify this, say that the child previously was identified as a girl. And this is the first time they're telling their parents, I think I'm a boy, and I'd like you to use this male name for me and male pronouns for me. And I want a haircut and I want to change my clothes, and just kind of putting all of this out there. That for this person, they've probably been thinking about it for quite some time. And for the parents, this might be the very first time they're hearing this information, in which case, sometimes parents react great and they're like, okay, sure. And then inside they're thinking, okay, what is happening? And then other times parents are just kind of frozen and they don't know what to do, what to say. That this concept is so foreign to many people who don't live in this world of questioning gender. And I know I see a lot with my teenagers sort of both of those presentations.
It's so interesting. As you bring up this idea that the adolescent, the child, and the family brings this up, to me, that sounds as though they already have a slight or vast knowledge of this difference within them.
You know,
Now,
I'd like to bop in now, Brian, because
please.
yeah, I want to add something to what Katie shared. Until she got to the very end, I feel like she made it seem kind of simple. It's really complicated sometimes. And I think that I've worked with parents who have come to me and they've been able to say, this was not a surprise to me at all. This is something that I was fully expecting might happen because I've watched my child from the time they've been very young navigate their gender. At the Bucks LGBT Center, where we both work, we have worked with kids as young as 5 and their parents with them. And so I just wanted to add that little piece before we got, more into the conversation. It's the reactions are vast and varied.
Absolutely. And you're going right where I was going, which I'm really happy you jumped in there, because I do think that there can be very different knowledge points and
Mhm.
perspectives of what's happening. And for people who don't really understand, well, let me back up. People who do, it could be a little bit more, my guess is a little bit more of an easier path to supporting that individual that's approached them, which I am sure that still takes some learning and experience and conversations, etc. And for those that get a bit surprised by this, or parents that maybe just don't understand it,
Mhm.
what do you advise they do?
Sure, I can jump in on that one. I think that first of all, we recommend pretty quickly that both the person who's exploring their gender gets help, gets a therapist, someone that can help them navigate that gender journey and can really unpack what's going on to be able to talk about what does gender mean and how have you come to be where you are now and what's influencing and how do we support this person in that journey. And we recommend doing some individual therapy around that. And then we also recommend a therapist for the families. So, for instance, at the Bucks LGBTQ Center, someone might work with the same therapist and do both the individual work and then family work kind of separate. Or they might work with two separate therapists. So that way, the person questioning gender has their own space to dialogue about whatever they need. And the family members have their own space to share anything that comes to mind. Because I just want to normalize as well that I agree. And I've seen some clients like Heidi had shared that sort of knew all along, especially if the child started showing some sort of gender preferences very early. I've
Mhm.
also seen clients who maybe shared sort of the typical gender norms as like born a little girl, love playing with dolls, all of that classic gender stuff until puberty. And then there was a pretty quick shift. And that can sometimes throw the parents off guard. And I just want to normalize that it is okay to be really sort of clueless as to what's going on. It's okay to have questions, to be confused, to even doubt whether the child is accurate in their assessment of their trans identity. That all of that is a normal response. And the therapist can help that family process through any sense of excitement or fear. Because we live in a pretty harsh world for someone who identifies as trans. And parents love their children and they want to protect their children. And this identity can be something that's very scary to people. So we try to create space for the parents to go through that work while also showing love and support for their child.
I love that, Katie. And you know what I really love about it is when parents have that space of their own to explore, then they can be allies to their kids. So they can come back and they can support. And most importantly, one of the most important things I've found is they can allow their child that space to explore without having an outcome in mind.
Mhm.
Because those outcomes and those, sometimes those conflicts for parents, they have a place of their own to discuss.
Because you both have talked about here the idea of how the family processes this. And in Katie's reflection a moment ago, she really quite interested in um, gender journey.
Mhm. Yes. So the phrase gender journey is not mine. I did not make that one up. A lot of providers in this field use that expression to explore the process, this ongoing process of understanding who am I.
Mm,
In this greater Philadelphia area, the CHOP has a gender and sexuality clinic that is fantastic and really works with kids when they're connected to their care around exploring this gender process. I
mm,
think overall, and from the literature, is just a great way of describing the ongoing nature of gender. That really, for all of us across the gender world, there's where we're born and there's how we come to understand who we are. And for some people, such as other topics in your show, Brian, it's what is masculinity and how do I relate to that? And then within the transgender world, some of the same questions are happening, but the gender might not be what you were assigned at birth.
mm. And so with masculinity, because we are minding men here, what I'm really hearing you say is this gender journey truly can be quite fluid, but also can look like anything. And really, we have to find ways to maybe go on our own gender journey in our own families.
Yeah, I agree, Brian. I mean, I think the biggest thing is not having that outcome in mind. One of the biggest mistakes I see parents make sometimes is they get caught up in the little things. So, I might have a parent that I'm working with who a child comes to them and says, "Can I cut my hair?" And the parent is aghast. They absolutely cannot imagine that child without that long flowing hair. And it's in these situations where a lot of tension gets built up. Although these small things, what we consider clothing changes, changes in hairstyle, those simple things are ways that kids explore gender. And hair grows back.
Mm,
But the amount of damage or the amount of support that a parent can offer by saying yes or saying no or arguing can really last a child and then adult's lifetime.
Mhm.
wow. Hair to me just seems like something we always miss and yet can throw us off so much when it comes to gendered identity. Um, it's what are there other, let's say, I'll say nuances or over like perceived things we don't even recognize that when somebody starts looking at their own masculinity, femininity, or in between that they kind of tinker with or try to make sense with or work with?
Absolutely. Some of the common ones that we hear from our clients, things like height. How tall are you? And sort of what is the normal height for someone who's male? And then what's the normal height for someone that's female? And then how does that differ? And how does that impact your understanding of who you are?
Hmm,
Um, Size in other ways, the shape that we have. Some people are curvier, some people are a little bit more kind of just narrow. And what does that mean for gender? And how does that affect somebody as they're growing and developing in these bodies, either as teenagers, young people, or adults, and how our bodies change over time? Another one that I think of is shoe size and how even our shoes are gendered. Are you a men's size 8 or a women's size 8? And that is not the same size. And so all of that comes into play.
hmm,
Heidi, what else do you say?
And what I was going to add, probably the biggest one I see when I work with what we call trans masculine clients, which are clients who may have been born into a more classically gendered female body and now identify as males. The biggest one I see is typically voice.
Mm,
When we
mhm.
talk about those ways where people have this shortcut of identifying us, voice, even on the other side of the phone, can say, "I am a fill in the blank." It might be male, it might be female. And so, voice is something I see clients struggle with all the time. And
hmm.
we typically don't even think of when we think of body.
That's amazing. You make me think of a lot of things, particularly my old days where I used to sing, act, and dance for a living. And one of my teachers was what they call a countertenor, which in opera is a gentleman who can sing all the different octaves of the scale and even sounds like a female in this context when he sings. And in fact, he ended up doing a show, the Broadway show Chicago, where he was the gentleman who dresses like a woman who's a reporter and sings as a female. And he went through so much of different experiences of explaining about just who he was from this voice that he would present to the world. I remember learning so much from him. This was almost 20 years ago, but that I never even thought of voice either. Shoe size, oh my goodness, I don't even want to start. It's amazing that this is all these little things. And when you're looking at all these different components of the body, I wonder how much is body image the shift? Is there a shift? Is there an objectification that takes place, a confusion? Can you help us understand a little bit with these different components when somebody starts to recognize maybe that their gender isn't as absolute as others may believe, that it's their own absolute? How do they connect with their body and their body image? What do they say in your sessions? What has been your experience?
Probably there are as many reactions as there are clients, quite honestly. For some people, I've seen very positive responses where it just explains so much to a client and their body image immediately improves as they begin to make some very simple changes.
Hmm.
Other clients, particularly those clients who are still internally processing and trying to understand their bodies and their gender, sometimes it does lead to some conflict or even some unhealthy ways that these, adolescents and even adults try to change the body, such as through an eating disorder.
Mhm. And to go from what Heidi was sharing, that's where one of the words she used earlier, parents who are allies, family members that are supporting and encouraging folks to be able to cut their hair or make some changes, do better from what I'm seeing. Those clients who have support, just one supportive family member can help in so many ways. But those who feel more isolated, either because they haven't come out yet and they're still struggling with that process, and coming out meaning that declaration that I think I'm a boy, um, they may struggle, or people who don't have that support, who don't feel they have the standard ways of changing their bodies available, we'll see them engaging in some very risky behaviors, either binge eating, so the shape is just round, not really male or female, it's just sort of this
Mhm.
round body. Or conversely, you've seen clients that will restrict, especially with the trans masculine. So as Heidi said, someone who's born a girl and identifies as a man will restrict to a point where maybe they stop having their period and it's about gender as opposed to necessarily body size and body image, though that is definitely in play. We find it overlaps, if you will.
So, so as somebody who I'm learning here, and I come from a context of understanding some things of body image and eating, part of me wonders, as for the audience, if I was an audience member listening to this, what I hear you saying is it sounds like they are in control or trying to control something for themselves in that vein. You know, is that dangerous?
It depends. Again, I give you a lot of it depends answers because it can be something that's not so dangerous, just some simple experimentation
Mhm.
can lead to something very dangerous. Particularly Katie was giving the example of a client who, we might see who has starved themselves or restricted their food intake to the point where their period goes away. Their body is reacting and it's telling us that they're malnourished.
Mm.
So in that example that Katie provided, yes, it is dangerous.
Yeah. And how do you help someone who maybe is transitioning to more masculine male orientation in the outside world, and they have this the period? They have literally they don't know how to handle the way that their body's functioning, or they're upset with having a period. How do you help them understand that?
I mean, I think one part of it is, and to prevent from going kind of too technical into the world of what transition means, is we get that person linked with a provider, a therapist, such as someone at the Bucks LGBTQ Center, who
Mhm.
can serve as this guide to all of the different resources in the community. Because to really dive into that, we're looking at referrals to some medical providers and mostly where we want to keep it today is just recognizing the need to support this person. Where if there's something going on in their body that makes them feel uncomfortable, whether it's a period or that they're stuck at 5 foot and they're anxious about their height, we
Mhm.
need to get that person connected to support. And we need to help the parents have support. And if there's a disconnect between the family wanting to have this, say, a teenager take steps towards transition,
Mhm.
to hold space for that family to talk through what's going on.
And
Because there's a lot of technical stuff that goes in for what transition would be, how to manage a period. Our recommendation really is just lean on the providers, let somebody else guide you through this process, and providers that are specifically trained in working with people in the trans community, because that's really important since it is so complicated, to your point.
Katie, can I add in here because Brian, this might be a resource for you or for another therapist who's watching. Katie and I actually wrote a book all about body image in working with what we call gender expansive clients. And by that, we just mean clients who don't necessarily identify fully as the gender in which they were born. It's called A Clinician's Guide to Gender Identity and Body Image. And so, even though it's not necessarily a resource that is a parent resource per se, I did want to throw it in and mention that for any therapists tuning in, that might provide a nice guideline for them.
it's fantastic. The idea here of making sure that there's the core support with specialists, with people who understand, who are able to guide this and almost help the individual manage expectations and exploration. I cannot thank you enough for making sure that we say that on the air.
Mhm.
It's super important, and I learn so much from the two of you, just in that aspect. It's always good to be reminding everyone that how this really needs proper support, and we can't make judgments, and we can't sit here and just decide that somebody is going to struggle because maybe what they're going through, they're going to be okay with it. And I'm really happy that you're normalizing this as we're talking. So thank you.
And I'd like just to jump in on that one, Brian. One thing I want to make sure we're also very clear about is being transgender, having questions about your gender identity is not clinical. Like it's not a disease, it's not a pathology of any kind. It's just questioning your gender, and your identity is just that. It's who you are. However, the things involved, such as the stress of coming out or conflict in the family, bullying experiences that people might have at school as kids don't always understand their peers who are coming out.
Mhm.
There's a lot of other issues involved that require that clinical support, usually. But being trans itself is not pathological.
Isn't that amazing? I always find, particularly when we're going into these types of explorations of self, which, mind you, I think everyone should be questioning and looking at their ideas of gender within themselves. It's always the outside influence that we have to make sense of.
Mhm.
It's so true. I mean, that's where we learn about gender, as you started off by saying. When my daughter was young, she was born, and we immediately, because she was bald, we immediately got her ears pierced. Again, a gendered choice.
Mhm.
And when she was about 1.5, she decided she wasn't going for those earrings. And that kind of gender nonconformance has
Mhm.
really lasted her entire lifetime. She is not a typical girly girl by any means. And so expanding these conversations to include the fact that gender is just a socially constructed type of idea is really important.
It's fantastic. It makes me think of my daughter. One day we send her for Fridays at school. We put her in a dress, and one day she says, I want to wear pants.
Mhm.
Okay. Right?
Mhm.
Those little nuances can mean the world to people when they start to really feel like they are themselves.
Mhm.
I cannot thank you, Dr. Dalzell and Katie. I cannot thank you enough for doing this. This has been a pleasure. Where can we find out more information about the both of you?
So we have a website at the Bucks LGBTQ Center. So www dot bucks, BUCKS, LGBTQ.com. And we'll make sure you guys have that information. And all of that will show how to contact us, have a guide for parents, as well as information about the book that Heidi referenced.
Fantastic. You both are wonderful. You are a step ahead of everybody. And thank you for gracing us with all of your knowledge.
Mhm.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us in Minding Men. I hope you really relate to this. This is some wonderful, wonderful stuff that both Dr. Dalzell and Kayti are both presenting to us. And I hope you have a wonderful day.